Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to my talk today for the Wyoming Blockchain Stampede. My name is Andrew Hinkes. I'm an attorney with Carlton Fields and its national blockchain practice. I'm an adjunct professor at New York University's Stern School of Business and NYU's School of Law. And I'm excited to talk to you today about governance and blockchain networks. We're going to start on the slides. Thank you. So I started with two quotes. We've elected to put our money and faith in mathematical framework that is free from politics and human error, and no leaders, no rules, in code we trust. These quotes from prominent figures and prominent enterprises in the blockchain world are great quotes for a talk about governance because they suggest a version of reality that perhaps isn't true. We're going to talk a little bit about this meme that blockchains and blockchain systems are governed by math and that humans don't have any say in their operations through this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about what the law has to say about governance and what lawyers need to know about governance of crypto systems so they can properly and ethically advise their clients about these systems and so that they can learn to be better purveyors of legal services in the cryptocurrency field. So what do we talk about when we talk about governance? Governance is the process of interaction and decision-making among the actors involved in a collective problem that leads to the creation, reinforcement, or reproduction of social norms and institutions. We think a lot about government when we think of governance, and government is one offshoot of the idea of governance. It's an organization that has the responsibility and authority to make binding decisions that apply to a certain geopolitical system, typically through the application of laws. Laws are rules that have to be followed, and if not, will be punished with consequences. We also think about politics and governance, and politics is simply a way by which people reach collective decisions that are binding and that are enforceable upon that group. So we're talking about the big picture idea of governance here. Why do we care? Well, blockchain went from a hobbyist's curiosity in 2009 to a massive industry and a set of really impactful and important software packages and structures that are being used or touted for use in a variety of matters. So we need to understand what blockchains really are, how they work, and who controls them, so we can understand what they're really useful for or appropriate to do, or what things are appropriate to do with them. There are a number of products and services that are being developed on top of blockchains. And therefore, if you are building something on top of another technical layer, you need to understand what really is happening on that technical layer. You wouldn't build a house on quicksand. If you want to understand how to build a robust system, you need to have a strong foundation. And finally, the marketing of blockchains and blockchain-enabled systems and products has also relied upon a number of memes, some of which might be true and some of which might be more aspirational or marketing puffery. In order to be a savvy consumer, you need to understand the difference, and oftentimes that difference comes down to governance. Why should lawyers necessarily care about governance? Well, depending on what kind of lawyer you are, the governance of a crypto system or a decentralized public network system might be very important. If you're a securities or a commodities lawyer that's facilitating the issuance of certain products for your customers, you need to understand the underlying network so that you can assess the risks and advise your clients on how to make appropriate disclosure. If you're an intellectual property lawyer, you need to understand the licenses in some of the underlying systems so that you can understand whether a product that's built on top of a blockchain can be licensed in a certain way, and whether some art that's been created on top of a blockchain may be patented, or whether certain licenses in the underlying technology that's incorporated in that new technology makes it so that the software may or may not be wholly or partially patentable. If you're a litigator and you want to handle cases involving crypto assets, you need to understand what users can and can't do, what systems can and can't do, and what sorts of information can be obtained from a system, and what sort of remedies can be imposed against a system. Ultimately, if you want to do something to or with a crypto asset system in litigation, you need to understand where the power in that system resides. If you're a deal lawyer, you are engaged in transactional work, you need to understand what representations and warranties can or can't be made about a system, And you're going to need to understand the limitations of the system in order to understand the relationship of the parties to any deal. And finally, if you're a technology lawyer that likes to work with startups and you're advising clients that are innovating on top of existing blockchain systems, you need to understand how the selection of a certain system may impact the development of this new business or this new model or this new technology. So when we think about governance, we immediately think about good or bad governance, but there is no good or bad governance because governance itself is inherently subjective. In various times, we've thought that monarchies or theocracies or representative republics were the best way to govern people. And there still can be disagreement about what is the most effective governing solution. We can think about governance by assessing the effectiveness of governance on a spectrum of characteristics. And there's a whole bunch of them on the slide, which essentially are the characteristics of the effectiveness of governance. And there may or may not be a desire for more transparent or less transparent governance. Bias may or may not be important in a given system, but there are ways that we can measure the effectiveness of governance, and we can look at the characteristics of governance by thinking about a lot of the factors that are listed there in the slide. Another important point is that governance may arise in a number of different ways. Governance can be designed. It can be coded into a system. It can be arrived at by a contract. It can be pushed down upon people from atop by a law. Or governance can happen spontaneously. It can just sort of erupt, or it can develop over time as people think about the way they do things and try to innovate or try to make it better. Now, when we think about governance of crypto asset networks or public network blockchains, we're really thinking about what determines the features and functions of a given system. And so naturally, we think about the consensus mechanism, which is what I call the technical control of the system. The consensus mechanism in Bitcoin, for instance, is the set of conditions that needs to occur in order for the database of transactions that have been completed that we call the blockchain. What do we need to do in order to update that to reflect new transactions? What must be done? What form of information needs to be in a message? What do the miners need to do to add messages to blocks? What do the blocks need? What needs to be done to the block in order to verify the block? What do nodes need to do in order to trust a message indicating that a block was verified, and so on? All these things that I just described to you require some user interaction, but ultimately the rules for those different things come from the code base. And so if the code base can be changed, then hypothetically the consensus mechanism can be changed as well. So thinking about technical control as a function of the consensus mechanism is really saying we look to the code. However, the code may not in every situation be able to address every technicality. Just like in a written contract, no contract can address every possible contingency. In certain cases, blockchain networks have encountered crises, unintended consequences, or situations that were not anticipated. In those circumstances, there needs to be political control. Who has the ability to address a crisis and try to solve a problem? We've seen political control sort of supersede or trump technical control in situations like the DAO, where a smart contract that was built on top of Ethereum encountered a crisis. It was broken and it was being rated by a user, and there was a particular concern that the operation of that smart contract would have some negative repercussions on the entire Ethereum environment. So certain political actors within the Ethereum community started to agitate for changes to be made to the code in order to address the problem created by the DAO. And so that's an example of where political control can supersede technical control. And of course, we can look at the actors that are empowered in order to do tasks to facilitate transactions. You have the consensus mechanism, but there need to be computers operating in order for the consensus mechanism to actually operate. And so you've got miners and node operators, and they may be able to exercise certain control because they can decide when they want to update their software, or if they want to not accept certain transactions. It's unlikely, given the history of the way that these systems have operated, but it's not impossible that those actors may rise up and exercise a certain amount of control. All, or at least most, public network blockchains are based upon open source software. And the idea of open source isn't that you can see all the code, but that the human readable code is publicly available to be reviewed. And when we talk about open source, we really are thinking about two different things. We have grassroots open source software, which is self-created, self-operated, not sponsored, voluntary contributions. Grassroots is what you think of when you think of open source. It's a bunch of people, maybe they don't even know each other, working together to develop something. Equally important is corporate open source. And a great example of that is Red Hat Linux. It's an open source software, but the development is paid for and guided by a private company. One of the best known open source software systems was a version of the Unix operating system called Linux, which that project was spearheaded by a gentleman named Linus Torvalds. And Linus's law was named after Linus Torvalds. And what he says in sort of advocating for the effectiveness of open source software development is that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And what that really means, besides for it sort of sounding clever, is that if you have a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds looking at a problem, they are going to find the problems. If there's enough people looking at it, the bugs will show themselves. And that's sort of a rebuke to the idea of a very well-funded, very sophisticated group of people devoted as their main occupation to developing software. So most, like I said before, most cryptocurrency systems, most public network blockchains are based on open source software. Open source software is typically distributed under a licensing agreement. These agreements may or may not restrict certain aspects of what a user or purchaser of that software can do with it. Typically, open source licenses will allow the licensee to redistribute, to modify. Sometimes they can sell it. Sometimes they can improve it. But most of these licenses will disclaim all rights and responsibilities for the operation of the software. And they essentially say, you take this as is, where is, with no remedies against me, the writer, for what I've created. Now, when we think about crypto systems, and when I say crypto, I mean public network blockchain systems and their system functionality, most of these systems prioritize censorship resistance and maintaining immutability. What do these terms mean? What is censorship resistance? What is immutability? When you hear these terms, when it comes to censorship resistance, you should think nobody that keeps me from transacting. And when you think immutability, you should hear really, really hard to change a transaction that's already gone through. Because these, unfortunately, are marketing words. Immutability is a clever and pithy way to say it's really, really hard to overwrite a transaction. As long as people have the ability to update software, then no transaction is ever fully immutable. Bitcoin has an absolutely stellar reputation for its security and for its immutability. But I don't think anybody would say that there is no set of circumstances in which a Bitcoin transaction could ever be rolled back. Censorship resistance, similarly, is the ability to resist somebody keeping your transaction to go through. And so when you think about a blockchain that might be touted as censorship resistant and immutable, think about, can anybody stop me from transacting? In the circumstance of Ethereum and a few other networks, we have seen that the will of a group of people can override the censorship resistant quality of the technical operation of the blockchain. Again, with the crisis with the DAO, there was a situation that, had it not been addressed, would have resulted in someone who was considered by many a bad actor siphoning off a tremendous amount of value from other good faith participants. And so a group of people decided that the best thing to do was to roll back a whole bunch of transactions to essentially change the network so that it is put in a state where the smart contract never had existed, and allow people to reclaim their assets, which functionally rolled back thousands and thousands of transactions made on the network by that smart contract. So when we think of public network blockchains, we should think about who really controls them. Developers have the ability to modify and update the code. And so in a sense, if a network is going to change, it's going to be the developers that write the code that actually change the way that they function. However, not every developer has the ability to propagate or to publish their change. In many systems, only a subset of developers, called core developers, have the ability to actually adopt a change, include it in the latest release of the software, and distribute it out. So perhaps it's the core developers that have that control. You could think about miners as being in control, since the miners are the actors in many platforms, or in many networks that have the ability to actually add transactions. If all the miners conspire together in order to keep a certain type of transaction from being added, or to keep a certain party's transactions from being approved, they may in effect be able to control the functionality of a network. What about the node operators? They're the ones that keep track of the database of transactions that we call blockchains. They also might decide that they don't want to accept blocks of transactions that have been verified by miners if they come from a certain miner, or if they come from a certain miner in a certain location, or if they come from, or if the block includes a transaction from a certain party. They might be affected by regulation that says you're not allowed to accept a transaction from a certain place or a certain user. And most importantly, the node operators are the ones that decide which version of the code they're going to run. So a core developer might update the software to include some new feature, but if the node operators don't want to use that new feature, they may never upload that code, and that code improvement or modification that was made by the core developers may have no effect at all because it never goes live. Founders of these systems sometimes can have outsized control. Nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is, and so it would be dubious to say that he's exercised any control over Bitcoin, at least after he stopped communicating with the world. But as we've seen with Ethereum, founders can sometimes exercise outsized control. Sometimes the founders can be subject to a cult of personality, where their off comments can be viewed as shifting the direction of the project. In a strange way, exchanges can also have an outsized control on a public network blockchain system. Exchanges are the venues or the intermediaries that facilitate exchanges of one asset for another. And unlike in the traditional securities markets, there are not QSIPs or identifiers for a given instrument. So an exchange can decide what they're going to host or not, meaning what they're going to allow their users to trade on their exchange or not. And in case of an argument as to whether my version of an asset or your version of an asset is in fact the correct asset or the real asset, an exchange might be put in a situation where it makes a decision that drastically influences which network will be considered the real one, which may influence the amount of resources thrown at the network, or supporting the network, which may influence security over the network, the popularity of the network, the financial incentive to support the network, and could ultimately severely weaken a network. And finally, social influencers can, like exchanges, influence which networks are used by whom and when. So there are a bunch of different ways in which different actors in sort of the public network blockchain ecosystem can exert levels of control over those systems and how they function. So, okay, we're 20 minutes into this presentation. Why does this matter? Well, as long as people are using these systems to convey value and to transact among each other, the governance of the systems are critical. If you have impeded decision-making about changes to the software code, you may find assets becoming unavailable or locked or behaving in a certain way, or in case of a fork, potentially devalued. Software might not be maintained properly, which could expose bugs and not allow the developers to identify the bugs and handle them quickly. This can allow 0 days to be discovered and exploited without a quick reaction to protect everyone who uses the network. In times of crisis, you may get an inefficient response. I kind of just described that. But you might also have a non-altruistic response, meaning a developer or someone who's empowered to respond may decide to respond to their benefit and not to the benefit of all users. And finally, we've kind of mentioned this before, but we'll talk about it head on here. If there is a loggerheads between users or developers, if people can't agree what to do with the system could fork, which in many circumstances is not viewed as a positive thing. So how can we avert these risks? That's what we should be thinking about. But now let's talk a little bit more about forks, since we keep mentioning them. The idea of a fork is that there's a modification to the code so that it's prospectively or in the future distinct from the existing code base in a network. It operates as a variance from the default assumption that if two different chains emerge, the longest chain should govern and a short chain should be viewed as an orphan to be abandoned. This is something that was built into proof of work and inherited from Bitcoin. Satoshi acknowledged that given that nodes are going to be in different places and they may communicate with each other and with miners at different speeds, it's possible that two different versions of a blockchain record could emerge, and the one that has more work put upon it, meaning the longest chain, should be the one that governs. And if you're maintaining a shorter chain that is different than the longer chain, you should discard that and start maintaining the longer chain. But in reality, forks don't necessarily, the kinds of forks that we're concerned about don't arise because of technical issues. They sometimes arise because of philosophical issues or intentionally. Sometimes you see that folks want to fork a system because they want to take advantage of seigniorage. Seigniorage is an economics term that basically describes the difference in value of an instrument versus the cost to make it. So if you're a government that issues $1 and it costs you 12 cents to make $1, the 88-cent difference is what we'll call seigniorage. And so as the issuer of currency or the issuer of an instrument, it can be very, very lucrative to you as the issuer to issue it if your cost of production is much less than the recognized value. You may also have a situation where there's a project and some of the folks who have been contributing to the project don't like where it's going. They think that certain changes should be made, or they think that perhaps the project has been hijacked by a certain charismatic individual that has told everyone that the world should be viewed a certain way, and they disagree. So forks can happen to allow for different development paths. People might decide that they don't like the way it's going, and so they might want to control the direction of the project. And finally, there might be some changes proposed that certain people who support the network just don't agree with. And so those sorts of changes occurred. I would say the don't agree with change happened in Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. Control the direction of the project was likely observed in the Bitcoin Cash split. And we've also recently saw a fork in the Steam network, which is kind of interesting to think about. But what this does is really throw into question, what is the network? If anybody can change the code so that it is not prospectively compatible and lure a sufficient number of people who are supporting the old code to support the new code, you might have two networks, both of which can say, I'm the real network. Which one's the real network? Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. Say you have Bitcoin, and say you fork Bitcoin into 3 different systems, each of which have a meaningfully different functionality in some way. Now, say you take that one that looks most like the original version, and then all of the developers change teams from the third one to the first one and start to then modify each of those systems. At a certain point, it becomes difficult to tell which one is the original system or the real system. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out what is the authentic version of a system after forks occur. In the case of Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, the forked version or the new version or the modified version was able to keep the original name, and the original version was given the classic name, sort of like Coke and Cloak Classic, but inverted. And so one of the questions is, who controls the ticker for Bitcoin? Unlike other systems, there aren't things like QSIPs that identify the one specific legal or industry recognized name. So who should be responsible for controlling these systems after all? Should there be any one person who's responsible? And if we're deciding someone's responsible, what tools should they use? Should they be able to supersede system functionalities like immutability with political choices? Should we be focusing on the community and asking them what they want the system to do? Should we be making technical choices like writing code that has backdoors? Or should we create these systems in a way that really bow to regulation? Should code be written so that it complies with the law? Should we be writing code that specifies what to do in a crisis? And if we don't, who, if anybody, is appropriate to respond? Should these responders be people that the community of users decide? Or should they simply be people who are able to exercise power? And is the exercise of power itself sufficient authority to exercise power? These questions don't have easy answers. These are really complicated questions. They are important questions economically, but they're also important questions philosophically, because the best architected system is still going to run into occasional problems. The good news is that we have literally thousands of years of experience in trying to figure these issues out. We call it in the legal world corporate governance. The idea here is that you can organize under a legal grant of power into a fiction, the fiction that there's something besides for a bunch of people working together. The fiction recognizes that there's a legally distinct entity, but the fiction demands its price. The fiction requires that the entity document what it's doing and tell the government about it. The entity has to pay taxes. The entity has to disclose what sort of things it's going to do, and it has to file reports. In exchange, the people that created the entity get powers to act through the entity, not through themselves, and they get a limitation of liability. So this sounds like a pretty good deal. It used to be the sort of deal that you had to get by asking the sovereign. Now, in most countries, it's a relatively pro forma thing. You file a piece of paper and pay a fee, and voila, you get to proceed under a legal fiction. And so we can look at the various designs that were created in the form of corporate governance in order to try to determine whether some of these governance tools that were created for legal entities can be used for these sorts of entities as well. In most corporate governance in the Western world, you have corporations or similar entities that rely on directors and officers to function. They are given a specific authority, and that authority is derived from legislatively created law and interpretations in cases. And so these grants of power allow the entity to assert its legal existence, balance against responsibilities like we talked about it, owed to the entity, to its owners, and duties owed by those that are able to control and guide the entity to those others as well. And so we're going to very briefly look at some fundamental ideas of corporate law. The idea is that there are managers, typically a board of directors that run the entity. They're agents to the owners, who are typically called shareholders. They don't do the day by day, but they're responsible for management. The board appoints officers who run the day-to-day operations. Those officers have the same kind of duties. The board should be informed about the business. They need to do diligence to understand what the company does, to help it strategize and plan. And the board should be involved in major decisions and approve them, such as entering into major transactions and board member appointments and such. There are two fiduciary duties that are really important for us to talk about. One of them we'll talk about on this slide is the duty of care. The basic idea is that a board member or officer, director or officer, has to make careful, informed decisions by assuming an active role throughout the entire decision-making process. In doing this, the directors need to assure that they have the required information. They have to actually devote time to reviewing it and get help from experts if necessary. They should rely upon the opinions or reports of experts, and they should seek out professional competence in finding experts or information that they should use when they make decisions for the company. They can't delegate this duty, and they have to keep records of their actions. There's also, perhaps equally important, is the duty of loyalty. The idea here is that these directors and officers have an important role in the operation of the company, and they have to be loyal to the company and, by extension, its stockholders, by not putting themselves against the interest of the corporation. These sorts of issues come up when a director is on both sides of the transaction or stands to benefit from the transaction, meaning they're interested, or if they're not independent, meaning that they're beholden to another party with an interest in the transaction. And directors can have interests that differ from the stockholders. Sometimes this arises when they have the chance to obtain equity in the company or options they might exercise to get equity in the company. Obviously, these folks are compensated and obtain benefits. Sometimes when there's a change of control, they can receive payouts. Sometimes you hear those called parachutes. And they're generally provided with benefits for their role, including indemnification or insurance. And so to resolve these issues, the primary weapon is disclosure. everybody needs to fully disclose when conflicts arise to the board and to the stockholders. You can create procedural safeguards throughout the process of a given transaction. In certain cases, appoint special committees to handle transactions where a certain board member or officer's loyalty might be at issue. So people have looked at corporate governance and said, boy, the people who support public network blockchains, they seem to have a lot of the same responsibilities and powers. Maybe we should impose duties upon them as well. And so there's been some suggestion that developers or node operators may exercise discretion or have power that impacts other users of the system who don't have the same sort of power. And that means people who are using the assets that may not operate a node or mine, may not be writing code. They have interests, and they may not have an easy way to express those interests. Putting these duties in place may protect consumers who rely on them and otherwise lack recourse. This, again, is the users we were talking about. It may be an effective way to mitigate some of the risk involved in using these systems. It might lead to better products, and it might spur others to mitigate risk by doing things like getting professional certifications so that the world knows that they're competent to do what they do, or perhaps getting insurance. As you might imagine, there are also very significant arguments against imposing fiduciary duties on various actors in a typical blockchain ecosystem. Requiring there to be duties makes the cost of being a developer go up. So it might disincentivize people to volunteer on these projects and thus inhibit innovation, increase the costs. And other people have said, look, we have contracts. The license is the only thing that I care about, and it says I take no responsibility. Some people have said that I have the right to write whatever I want. All I'm doing is writing code, and I have free speech rights, so you can't make me. And so the question really becomes, if we undertook a measure like imposing fiduciary duties on coders, do we get people who decide that they're going to remain anonymous and not publicize their involvement so we get more Satoshis? Or do we get people who decide that they're going to stay in the shadows and use their power for nefarious purposes? And so I call that more Vinix. That is a reference to Alexander Vinnik, who was purportedly the ringleader behind BTCE, a venture that was allegedly used to launder a lot of proceeds of the Mt. Gox hack. So one thing we should think about is, what are crypto systems and what are they being used for? Are they different than other networks? And what kind of networks are these really? In a manner of speaking, cryptocurrency blockchain networks are being used in a certain respect as a replacement for certain trusted third parties. In many cases, they're used as replacement for conventional financial markets infrastructure upon which we transact value, transact securities, trade. It's also being used for things that are traditionally centralized and controlled by trusted third parties like the government, things like property records. And it's also being used to hold and transact assets for third parties, where third parties might have rights, think medical records or identity records. And all of these systems are already subject to considerable regulation. We've got tons of laws that protect privacy at this point. Those who hold assets and information for third parties are subject to things like data breach recording. And industry standards, if not regulations, require things that add more trust, insurance, and audits. So let's think about what blockchains might look like if they were treated and governed the way that financial markets infrastructure is treated and governed. And I've picked up a couple of the principles for financial market infrastructure. And we should look at a couple of these and figure out how the current state of affairs with blockchains kind of really maps here. We've got principle 2, which speaks to governance, that basically says that FMI needs to have clear and transparent governance that promotes the safety and efficiency of the FMI and supports the stability of the broader financial system and supports other relevant public considerations. Third principle that says that there should be sound risk management frameworks that should manage legal, credit, liquidity, operational, and other risks. Principle 17, which looks more at operational risk, says that an FMI should identify plausible sources of operational risk and mitigate their impact. The systems, policies, procedures, and controls. The system should have a high degree of security and operational reliability and adequate scalable capacity. The management should aim for timely recovery of operations in the event of a wide-scale or major disruption. If you know this industry at all, you probably have figured out that there's nothing like this in place for most public blockchains. It just doesn't exist. They are focused on the consensus mechanism, and minimal extrinsic governance, although there are some systems that have started to explore with certain collective governance, which are worth thinking about and taking a look at. The ethos with these public blockchains is just different. They look at censorship resistance and maintenance of the consensus mechanism as paramount. There's little concern in their operation for things like legal or regulatory risk, although certain activities that are adjacent to blockchains, like selling tokens, obviously at this point are subject of significant regulatory risk. And I kind of was a little sloppy there with cybersecurity, because while there isn't necessarily a lot of concern for cybersecurity, the networks themselves, particularly Bitcoin, are incredibly robust and incredibly secure because of the efforts that are put in by those who support the network. So it's not as though they're entirely agnostic to cybersecurity, but where you start to see cybersecurity risk sort of invade are as soon as you get to the things that are built around the blockchain and interact with the blockchain, secondary software, intermediaries, and the like. There is little to no dispute resolution transparency in these systems. They once again just point to the consensus mechanism and say, on this system, this is the arbiter of what is and is not. Use blockchain, Bitcoin as an example. The Bitcoin blockchain is dispositive of who controls what. Generally, these systems do not have documented procedures, policies, or practices. Generally, you get a license agreement, and that's about it. So the real question that we all need to consider, and that as lawyers we need to think about advising our clients on, is, do the benefits of these systems justify the acceptance of what appear to be dramatically higher levels of operational risk? And of course, as I alluded to before, the blockchains themselves are just the beginning, and generally they've been pretty robust. But as soon as secondary software starts to be built on top of and around these systems, it gets infinitely more complicated. You've seen wallets, for instance, get hacked. Very famously, a system called Parity that operates on the Ethereum network was hacked. Something along the lines of $200 million worth of assets were frozen, where their users could not obtain them, and there was no remedy for the Parity folks, unlike the remedy that was allowed for folks who were using the DAO smart contract. Exchanges can be hacked. Mt. Gox, for example, very famously was the first great exchange hack. There have probably been 100 since then, maybe 50. I might be exaggerating a little bit. And of course, there's an opportunity that Bitcoin could have said, okay, we're going to rewrite all the transactions that went into and out of the Mt. Gox wallets and give everybody their assets back. But nobody did it. There are assets that flow on blockchains that rely on assumptions not made on blockchains. Sometimes they rely on software to do things, and sometimes they rely on people to do things. And so there are intermediaries that are critical to certain assets, which create additional risk. And you take all of these assets and all these secondary software packages and all of this additional infrastructure being built around blockchains, and then you inject them into the institutionalized financial world. You start propagating this risk throughout a whole bunch of other parts of our economy, and it can seem a little scary. But let's look at, to a certain degree, how these systems actually operate. Let's start with granddaddy of them all, Bitcoin. And if you like the picture of the house on fire, this is sort of the way that I think about Bitcoin. It's anarchy with a little bit of direction. There are open discussions of proposals on how to change or improve Bitcoin. There is discussion that is conducted until there appears to be some sort of consensus that they want to implement a certain type of change. And then if there's enough of a consensus, that change might make its way to one of a group of core developers who are developers that are given commit access. And if the developer that has commit access decides they like the change, then the change can be committed to the code and might be included in the next release of the Bitcoin code. As you can probably imagine, this might make it very difficult to react quickly and to make decisions, since there is no orderly process and no perhaps expedited procedure for doing so. And so it's unclear what kind of checks and balances really exist. Given that it's sort of anarchy, it's not really clear what it is that might have caused one person to change their mind. And it's not really clear who can be pointed to as the person with responsibility. Core devs are obviously given a lot of power. They are the ones that essentially determine whether there has been consensus sufficient to decide that a change has been roughly agreed upon. And these core developers change over time. In certain instances, core developers have been kicked out and lost their key control of the software by other core developers and other folks involved in the development process due to political differences. And so the question becomes, are those developers owed due process? Who should be involved in identifying who can develop? Should anybody have this sort of control? Should be open to everybody. Who should be involved in the process of identifying core developers? Should it be just anybody? Should core developers be compensated? Some people say that compensating them makes them partial and makes them subject to somebody else's agenda, while others, and if you're subject to somebody's agenda, then you obviously have some issues with conflicts. While others simply say, being a core developer is a lot of work, maybe these folks shouldn't have to have side jobs. So even in something that is pretty rough around the edges and anarchic, there still has to be some sort of order. And we've seen that there are some issues here in the way that Bitcoin operates. We now move to consider Ethereum, probably the second most popular of the public network blockchain systems. Ethereum arose a little bit differently than Bitcoin did. It was not released into the world by a pseudo-anonymous creator. The core team that worked on Ethereum is very well known, and they actually crowdfunded the development of their system by selling tokens and created by a foundation, and that foundation engaged in some advocacy on behalf of the system. Although he is rather wont to say so, most acknowledge that there's a cult of personality around Vitalik Buterin, and his statements about Ethereum tend to have some very significant impact on the community of Ethereum users, and he still remains an influential developer and thought leader with respect to how Ethereum can develop over time. Interestingly, Ethereum previously touted that you could use it to build unstoppable applications. You can see a screenshot here on the slide of an older front page of the Ethereum website that has been taken down since the Ethereum bailout of the DAO. Bailout's the wrong word. Since the Ethereum fork in order to rescue the users from the DAO smart contract attack. And so some of the questions around Ethereum remain pretty significant. They talked about unstoppable applications, but we had a very significant application that was stopped. Who is it that really decided on the response to the DAO attack? Was it the Ethereum Foundation? Was it Vitalik? Was it some sort of amorphous public opinion or a poll? Was it pressure from the outside? Nobody really knows. But there was code written for a fork. There was a brief poll taken that unanimously supported using the code that was written that effectuated the fork. And it happened. Along the way, it led to a small but vocal group of dissenters deciding that they disagreed with all of the things that were occurring, not uploading the patch, and causing a split. And those dissenters are the ones that we call Ethereum Classic now. And so this led to so many questions. What happens in the next emergency? Should they be handled the same way? Should they be handled differently? Who should decide? Should they be handled at all? So far, the track record suggests that subsequent hacks, attacks, or crises have basically not been handled. We talked about parity before. The parity attack or the parity hack remains unremediated. I'm now going to pivot to talk about another system called EOS. And EOS embraces the idea that there is a consensus mechanism and then there is additional governance that has to happen independent of the consensus mechanism. They describe governance as the process by which the people of the community reach consensus on subjective matters of collective action that cannot be captured entirely by the algorithm, execute their decisions, and alter the governance rules themselves by a constitutional amendment. They conceptualize the idea of a constitution collaboratively arrived at by those who use the network that governs the way that those people are going to operate. Initially, they created a governing body to handle disputes called the EOS-IO Core Arbitration Forum. the validators or block producers, who basically work kind of like the miners and the nodes in this system, were supposed to be beholden to the rulings of this arbitration forum, and their role was to execute what the arbitration forum found after it handled a dispute. And at launch, there was a provisional constitution adopted. Almost immediately, there was a problem. There were 7 individuals whose accounts were stolen on the network. The 21 block producers unanimously voted among themselves to freeze the accounts of the affected persons without submitting it to the formal procedures of the arbitration forum. After the freeze went into place, the block producers filed a dispute against themselves to have their actions reviewed by the arbitration forum. This is sort of like a declaratory judgment action. Judge, tell me that what I did is okay. And the actions were ratified by an emergency arbitration forum arbitrator. And the arbitration order is probably unlike any arbitration order you've ever seen. But ignoring the form, the logic and reasoning here is also probably a little bit different than anything you're familiar with. The emergency measures were ratified, and it says that the logic and reasoning for this order will be posted at a later date. EOS has had some challenges in its governance. They, I believe, are on the 4th iteration of their constitution. At one point, they actually allowed members of the community to update their constitution on a Google document. And you used to be able to click this link and go on and see people actively conducting discussions in the comments and offering up their viewpoint on system governance. And I don't mean to pick on Ethereum or EOS necessarily. I don't know that anything that they're doing is right or wrong, or that anything that Bitcoin is doing is right or wrong. But what we're seeing here is a remarkable variety of approaches, informed in some ways by the situations that have arisen, the crises that they've had to deal with. But I think it's instructive to see the various ways in which different actors and different systems have attempted to work through some of these problems. We also should look at perhaps a slightly lesser known system that's taken an interesting approach called Decred. Decred is essentially a version of Bitcoin proof of work with an additional proof of stake element associated with it. It uses proof of work to add transactions, and it uses proof of stake to conduct some extrinsic voting for governance tasks. If you own Decred, or if you mine Decred, you can stake some of your Decred in a smart contract in exchange for the receipt of something called tickets. If your ticket is selected, then you are given the power to vote on governance matters. You can vote on proposed changes to the the consensus rules, and you can also vote to approve the work of proof of work miners. And the voting proposals for consensus rules are developed by an NB called Politeia. And Politeia is actually an entity that is paid a subset of the block rewards to work on improving the protocol. And the development entity in this case is actually an incorporated, legally addressable entity, although I'm given to understand at some point there was an effort made in order to take this entity and to try to make it more decentralized. And what Decred is doing is essentially not really allowing its off-chain governance to impact its on-chain consensus mechanism, allowing participants in the system to have some say. To me, this seems like a pretty measured approach and an interesting experiment. You could also look at all of these systems and think, maybe they're all doing this wrong. All of these systems rely on certain assumptions that arise out of game theory and are based on concept that everybody involved is going to act in their self-interest. Decentralization and proof of work is necessary in order to avoid a 51% attack. If anybody has majority control of the network, they can start to block transactions and potentially put in their own transactions. They could even start to, if they had a really significant amount of power, reverse transactions. All of the functionality of these systems are based upon certain assumptions of benevolent action by those involved. Miners are going to mine to get the asset because they think the asset's valuable. They're going to take actions in order to support the value of the asset, and therefore the thing that they get for mining is valuable. And miners are going to have incentive to devote increasing amounts of horsepower, or hash power, I should say, to the network because the stronger the network, the less likely it is that it gets hacked, which means that the asset will have a better chance of not being subject to really negative press and will hypothetically retain its value. And the stronger the network and the more secure, the more likely it's going to be valuable, and so on and so on. But this doesn't necessarily always work, because we've seen networks attacked on various occasions. For proof of stake essentially is you commit certain resources and you are given the opportunity under one of a few different procedures to be the validator that adds a certain block and takes the reward. However, if proof of stake is weighted, meaning the more you have of the asset, the better chance you have of being selected to add the block, you could eventually force people into things that, or you can eventually incentivize behavior that looks like an oligopoly or a cartel, which may or may not be the best thing for the network either. And finally, it might actually, in certain instances, be more lucrative to attack a network rather than support it. There's this website here, crypto51.app, that at a certain point would tell you the price that it costs in order to rent cloud computing resources to 51% attack a network. And if you can do that while also shorting the asset on a platform that allows for shorting, you might be able to actually make a bunch of money. I'm not suggesting anybody do this, but what I'm suggesting is there may be some problems in the inherent assumptions in the governance that's been embraced by a lot of different public network crypto systems that say the consensus mechanism can take care of everything. It may be that people do end up being the problem here as well. Let's shift back to one of the arguments that folks have offered, which is maybe the developers are the ones who should be liable. About 2 years ago, Commissioner Quintens of the CFTC released a statement talking about potential developer liability for code. And he talked about how code might in some ways actually be complicit or do something that might be viewed as violating CFTC's rules. And it could be that the CFTC might want to enforce against software code. What Commissioner Quintens suggested was that if a developer releases code that they could reasonably foresee when they create it would be used by a US person in a way that violates CFTC regulations, those developers might be viewed as aiding and abetting violations of the CFTC. This statement was not very well received by the crypto community and by the development community at large. The development community was rightfully pretty upset by this. They wondered at what point developing software was going to become a crime. And so the theory of liability that was suggested by Commissioner Quintens is called aiding and abetting a violation of the CFTC law. From his statement, he said it requires violation of the CEA, which is the Commodities Exchange Act, that the defendant developer know of the wrongdoing and intentionally assisted the wrongdoer. We've got some case law that lays out a slightly different test. It says that to find aiding and abetting a violation of CFTC law, the party so charged or so claimed against needs to have knowledge of the principal's intent to commit a violation of the act, and the intent to further that violation and take some act in furtherance of the principal's objective. It almost looks a little bit like a conspiracy sort of test, or an aiding and abetting in this case, but it requires a lot of knowledge and intent. But if you go back to what Quintens said, the developer reasonably foresees. So we see this idea of reasonably foreseeing modifying what are specific intent sort of allegations. And we also have to think about how durable this test is in the context of already released code. Suppose that you are, to argue by analogy, a chemical manufacturer that's been making chemical X for 20 years, and it has some sort of industrial application, and it's used all the time. Then one day somebody figures out that chemical X can be used to enrich a drug to make a new designer drug. Is it reasonably foreseeable that the drug could be created from this chemical? Probably not. It certainly doesn't rise to the level of intent, but reasonably foresee can be very blurry. Another example, if a party is creating a piece of code that accomplishes something very simple, like an escrow contract, it's entirely possible that that party did not expect the escrow contract to be used as part of something that might be considered to be a crime. So you might end up with instances of unintended aiding and abetting. There are also arguments about the open source license protecting developers. What if I have an open source license that says you take my code as it comes and I make no warranties or representations about what it will or won't do? The thing about a license agreement is that it's a contract. And a contract binds the parties to that contract, and in some cases, any intended or sometimes unintended third-party beneficiaries. However, these agreements don't bind the regulator, an enforcing agency, or law enforcement. So you might say vis-a-vis your user that we don't make any reps and warranties, but that may or may not matter to somebody who wants to investigate that code for wrongdoing. Also, you can't disclaim compliance with law in a private contract. For instance, a parent and a child can't, between the two of them, decide that the driving age in the state of Florida is 10 years old. A property owner and a demolition company can't decide between themselves that 3 a.m. is an appropriate time to demolish a 20-story building in violation of a zoning ordinance or a permitting requirement. As we all in crypto have learned, a private agreement can't necessarily excuse compliance with securities law or commodities law. So the license agreement is not really the most compelling argument against there being liability there. You also have heard the argument that I'm a dev, I can write whatever I want, I have free speech. And yes, you do have free speech, but you're asking the wrong question here. Whether code is or is not speech is not really contended, is not really an issue of contention at this point. Coding is generally regarded as speech, but it's not that you have freedom of speech. The freedom of speech that we think about is a freedom for the government to tell us it's freedom from the government telling us that we can't say a thing. It is not unconditioned. FCC versus Pacifica Foundation, 1978, Supreme Court ruled that indecent speech may be limited. Obviously, we've all heard about falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. And in Ward versus Rock against racism, we saw that time, place, and manner restrictions on speech are constitutionally appropriate as well. As a better example of how speech is not always protected, Elon Musk made this famous tweet about taking Tesla private at 420. And yes, he had every right to make that tweet, but it didn't mean that that tweet didn't violate the law. As we saw, the SEC believed that they did, and they brought an enforcement action against him for making this tweet. He had every right to, he was free to make this tweet and to say the words in this tweet out to the Twitter audience, but it didn't mean that the SEC didn't view it as a violation of the law. So, in summary, where does this leave us? We should all remember that cryptocurrencies and blockchain systems are, in many respects, very much still an experiment. Most of them still require humans to operate. Almost all of them still require humans for ongoing maintenance. Crises do happen, and despite the best consensus mechanism, there are usually humans that need to exercise judgment in order to handle those crises. Financial markets infrastructure is usually mass production software subject to considerable quality assurance, and blockchains really aren't built that way. Blockchains are not generally created like robust commercial products, and especially lately with the advent of so-called DeFi systems, where some of the most successful products brazenly talk about how they test their code in production. We can't think about these systems as being the same as a private, commercially tested, formally QA'd product. We also need to think about the relative fluency of the users of these systems in the necessary knowledge to assess them and evaluate them. Most consumers cannot read code. Even for the consumers that can read code, it may not be apparent to them everything that's going on by reviewing a given smart contract. People rely upon humans to explain the operation of certain systems so that they can understand what the software is supposed to do. And even when information is provided, it is often ignored. People have been gleefully investing funds into DeFi systems that are poorly documented or that are emblazoned with representations like, this is a game, this is an experiment, this is not tested code, do not invest. The reality is that people will use these systems if they think it's beneficial, even if they, quote, should know better. Given these facts, it's logical that companies may seek shelter with established companies that are active in this market. It may be easier to convince a board of directors to invest with a brand name consulting firm or a venerable computer technology company rather than a startup of people who say that they don't even bother to test their smart contracts. What is clear is that if you are a lawyer advising clients in this space, there needs to be clear and accurate communication of the shared responsibility of those who implement software and those who use software. Crypto still remains very much a caveat emptor world. Thank you, everyone who decided to attend this talk. Thank you to the folks at the Wyoming Blockchain Stampede and the WYO Hackathon for having me. Thanks to all the other wonderful panelists and speakers who came. If anybody needs to reach me, I'm available on Twitter at PropelForward. Thanks, everybody, and have an amazing rest of the WYO Hackathon and Wyoming Blockchain Stampede. Take care.